Well, let's kick off. It is 1 o'clock. It's time to begin and to welcome Congresswoman Elise Slotkin. And good to see so many of you here. I'm Mark Urban. I will chair the event, but attempt to retain as unobtrusive a role as possible, and simply here to magnify her insights, if that's at all possible. So just those of you who haven't come across her or met her before, a few quick words about her background. She is from Michigan. A Michigander, I believe, is the correct term. Yes. The other thing, bit of trivia, perhaps the state capital of Michigan. Who knows it? That thing about state capitals, does anyone know? Lansing. And your congressional district now includes part of Lansing, I think I'm right in saying. But in between becoming the representative for the 8th District of Michigan and, leaving there as a young university student, she did all kinds of things, including joining the CIA, becoming a Middle East analyst, 3 tours of Iraq, and then going on to work for the Office of Director of National Intelligence and a number of other senior roles, including in the White House. So she really does know the intelligence and military and security system, culminating in a period as the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security.
Yes, very long.
Really this informs the key point, I think, that she's here to talk to us about, which is to do with the US and its alliances in these particularly testing times, given the incumbent of the White House. I think what we'll do is we'll ask the Congresswoman to deliver her remarks. She's prepared a presentation. She's just off the plane from Baghdad, so it may well have some fascinating insights into the state of US alliances in the Middle East, as well as everything else. And then, depending on timings, I will probably ask her some further follow-up questions to really get things going. And I'll probably do that for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then we'll hopefully give the last third of the time for your own questions. So without further ado, I'll ask Elise to talk to us, and her theme is the American handshake, building trust and the future of U.S. alliances.
Can I use it up here? All right, I'm going to use this up here. Thank you for having me. Thank you to RUSI for hosting me on short notice. I am just back from Iraq and Turkey. I was there with the House Armed Services Committee. It's a committee that oversees our military. I'm on that committee, and we went in the wake of everything that's gone on with Turkey and Syria and the counter-ISIS fight. It's a real pleasure to briefly be here. I'm here for 24 hours on my way back home to Michigan. What I thought I would do is sort of go through a little bit about what we heard on our trip, but then talk more generally about what I see going on with our partnerships and alliances across the world. The conversations that I had in Turkey and Iraq with American leaders there, with Turkish and Iraqi leaders, with the counter-ISIS military leaders, reinforce for me obviously the ongoing relevance of what I want to talk about today, which is the critical importance of our bilateral and multilateral partnerships to our individual and collective national security. So as an American, as a CIA analyst, as a former Pentagon official, I'm also an Army wife and the stepmom to a brand new Army officer. I am confident that America is stronger when we work with allies and partners. But I also know that those partnerships are a two-way street built on trust. And what we're currently facing, particularly in the United States, is a growing trust deficit, both at home and abroad, between Washington and much of the American public, but also between the United States and some of our closest allies. But in order to understand how I think about allies and partners, I think it's a little important to understand where I'm coming from, why I was in national security to begin with, why I then decided to run for office, which is not a normal straight career path for someone in national security. For me, that story starts almost specifically at 9/11. I had just moved to New York City. I was on my second day of grad school at Columbia University when 9/11 happened. We watched and huddled around one TV as grad students in our student lounge. We watched the second plane hit. We watched the towers come down. And I would say almost immediately I knew that what I was going to do for a living was going to change. I think as we all certainly learned in the weeks and months afterwards, we were witnessing a generational event. One of those very rare moments in our history when everyone remembers exactly where you were and who you were with and what you were doing when those events happened. And for me, within a year, I was recruited by CIA, and within a year of that, I was sent to Baghdad on my first of 3 tours. For the United States, that certainly marked what I call the birth of the 9/11 generation. And that's a generation of us who came of age as young adults right as 9/11 happened. We went off to war almost immediately, and then came home to carry on that service and leadership in our own communities. We are obviously a very long 18 years past those events, and the struggles in the years that followed in foreign policy, if we are honest with ourselves, the damaging mistakes and misjudgments have created what I see as this huge trust deficit between American foreign policy leadership and the people that we serve. But events like, particularly because of events like the invasion of Iraq, the seemingly never-ending wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and what feels like an inability to actually help people in places like Syria have left large numbers of Americans, especially young Americans, in a place where they have lost trust in America's ability to succeed and lead abroad. For me, this is a very big problem. This should be a bright, flashing red light, because trust is our currency. For people in foreign policy and international affairs, that trust is the coin of the realm, and we cannot conduct our professional duties around the world without that trust. And we certainly can't lead. So it worries me, both as a national security leader and now as a member of Congress, that so many of our fundamental principles are under threat. The foundation of security and prosperity that we have enjoyed since World War II may actually be eroding. And I do not believe that we will simply be able to reset after a next American administration takes over, whether that's in a year or 5 years. The world has changed so drastically since the end of World War II and even since 2001 that we will need to redefine the principles for today's world. I expect this will require rethinking what international partnerships and coalitions look like for the next conflicts, and reestablishing that trust with our constituents, first and foremost back home, but also obviously with our partners and allies abroad. So let me reiterate the value statement that I opened with. I believe Americans, allies, and partners are indispensable to our physical and economic security. The NATO Secretary General came and spoke in front of a joint session of Congress, and he said that, quote, "The strength of our nation is not only measured by the size of its economy or the number of its soldiers, but also by the number of friends we have." And for many of us here today, that is a given, a truism, a commonplace thought. But in 2019 in America, it's a debatable proposition, controversial enough to force our then Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, to resign nearly a year ago because he believed in it. So obviously we know that the US did not win the Second World War or the Cold War on our own. We did not eliminate the threat of ISIS in places like Syria, or even tackle it without friends. And we will not succeed in staring down authoritarianism around the world alone. Our allies are indispensable, but we've not always treated our allies as indispensable over the years. And please don't get me wrong, I spent many, many years of my life, especially in the Obama administration, pushing our European allies in particular to increase their contributions and defense spending to more equitably share the burden around the world, particularly in the NATO alliance. When I was working at the Pentagon, I actually helped then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter build a sort of spreadsheet that showed what each partner in NATO, what each ally, in NATO was spending. Some were colored in red, some in yellow, some in green. And we used to take this chart around the world with us and shove it in front of our allies' faces and say, what more can you be doing? It was not a well-loved chart, so I'm very aware that there's disagreements on our approach, in part in working in coalition, but that we need to seek appropriate contributions for our allies. But that is just it. We ask for contributions because we need you. Lasting relationships need to be nurtured even when we don't see eye to eye. And certainly I felt that in spades when I was in Turkey a couple of days ago. We cannot treat allies as burdens or cash cows and expect them to deliver when we ask. Trust is having each other's back, quite literally. And trust is won with sound judgment, reliability, and dependability. And an erratic partner is the worst partner of all. The sudden withdrawal from northern Syria last month and the betrayal of the Syrian Democratic Forces, that local partner that fought on the front lines to counter ISIS, is frankly a prime example of how not to behave. This is precisely the erratic behavior that suggests to our partners and allies that the United States cannot be trusted. Unfortunately, this only contributes to this trust deficit that I'm talking about. Back home in Michigan, this issue had a particular resonance that surprised me, this pullout of Syria. And I think that's because, especially in places like Michigan in the middle of the United States, the American handshake has to mean something. When the US president suddenly announced that they're pulling out, that really stopped a lot of people in their tracks. They've probably never met a Syrian Kurd before or a Turk, but they felt this idea that your handshake is your bond. And I certainly was part of a group of people that sent in our 3- and 4-star generals to shake the hands of the people who would then be fighting and dying on the front lines. So breaking our word with the Syrian Kurds resonated with people. And it's important to realize that it's one thing to break our word with the Kurds, but it also broke our word with the whole theory of how we're fighting terrorism these days. For the United States, we learned some extremely hard lessons in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Most importantly, that the American public is not okay with American body bags and billions of dollars being sunk into these wars that we seemingly cannot win. So we changed our approach. It was very deliberate. We made a conscious effort to work by, with, and through partners on the ground, so that people who lived in that region were the ones on the front lines fighting for the change that we also hope to see. That was our theory of the case in going in, shaking the hands of the Syrian Kurds, and watching them go fight and lose almost 11,000 fighters on the ground to liberate places like Raqqa. That had a direct impact on our national security, on certainly national security here in the UK and in Europe. And your word is your reputation. So my deep concern, and the reason that I went to Turkey and Iraq in the first place, was because I think it's important to figure out how we're going to regain the trust of any ally or partner who in the future we're going to come to as Americans and say, hey, we really want to partner with you to fight this common enemy. It's going to be that much harder in order to secure their commitment, because any good partner on the ground would reasonably be questioning our staying power. We're going to need to earn back that trust, not only with the Syrian Democratic Forces in the immediate term, but with everyone else. So to begin to do so, I want to share some good old-fashioned principles that I hope we can follow in the American context. And this is all borrowed from my experience of being on the ground in Michigan and running for office in a very, very different place than the halls of Washington. So these are some principles that work on the ground in Holly, Michigan, where I'm from, and I think that they work in the international community. First, number one, get your story straight before you tell it all over town. The U.S. needs to be deliberative in our national security decisions. Foreign policy decisions should never be made just by one person or one agency or one branch of government. We are built as a system of checks and balances, and in an ideal situation, we have vociferous debate within the U.S. government before we go out with our public policy. Foreign policy by tweet is simply just bad policy. It is damaging to the relationships we have built over decades. So too is the fact that partners and allies cannot be certain which senior government official is speaking for who, whether they represent the president's wishes, whether they just represent their agency. That is very, very bad for building trust. So second, make friends with everyone because you'll never know who you need. This is a very Midwestern concept, right? We are stronger when we have lots and lots of friends. Different threats will require different coalitions. For a particular cyber threat, for instance, a small nation without much military might actually be the linchpin to that you need, where they house the computer servers that are where you're actually able to blunt that cyber threat. In another war zone, you may really need people like police trainers. So the Spanish and Italians who have national police forces might actually be the strongest foot forward we have in that coalition. This is the case in the Syrian Democratic Forces. They were on the ground, they were ready to fight. We simply do not know enough about the conflicts of the future, so we better make as many friends as we can to maximize our chances of pushing back on those threats. Third, and this is a sports analogy, which I think can be understood here as well, review the play with your team before you run it. We need to include allies and partners in our early planning. We have been working in coalition since 2001, and I think for any of the representatives of governments here, you'll probably reinforce what I hear all the time, which is, we don't know what you're doing. We don't know, we're in coalition with you, but we don't have insight into your strategy, your plans, your decision-making, your milestones. Please bring us into the decision loop. After many, many years of doing this, it is just common sense and should be in U.S. military doctrine to bring coalitions and allies and partners into the early decision making. Our partners and allies bring complementary skills and assets to the table. When our allies and partners learn of decisions like pulling out of Syria by tweet, then we have failed at this very basic concept. And then lastly, again, very Midwestern, under-promise and over-deliver. We need to be clear with ourselves and with our allies and partners and our publics about the goals and objectives that we have abroad. We have to practically plan to achieve them. We cannot solve every single problem. We are not going to bring grandiose ideas of Jeffersonian democracy to the Middle East. Many of our goals have been too ambitious, and therefore the public has seen us and our allies failing. We must be clear and clear-eyed about our objectives and communicate what they are ahead of time. Unfortunately, in the absence of trust, we know that our allies and partners will not stand still and wait for us to find our footing in the United States. It should come as no surprise that within days of us pulling out of northern Syria and standing by while Turkey intervened militarily, the Syrian Democratic Forces had gone and struck a deal with the Russian and Syrian regime. Our partners face their own urgent challenges, and if we can't engage them in a consistent and reliable manner, our friends will go it alone or hedge their bets. At some point, the trust will be too far gone, and America will be shut out of key decisions for the first time since World War II. Allies won't be willing to take the political hit of working with the United States and will be less safe and less prosperous as a result. But for us in the United States, if we face a trust deficit abroad, it is in no small part because we face a growing trust deficit at home between Washington and the rest of the country. There is a direct correlation between U.S. public support in leading abroad and the view we take of allies and partners. As someone who represents Michigan in the Midwest, let me tell you that our lack of trust in the national security institutions and ideas and philosophies that animate them is ever present. That lack of trust has led to this America-only foreign policy that for lots of people makes a lot of sense. And I want to be clear that domestic policies really, truly do matter for the foreign policy makers. When I decided to run for office, it was in the beginning because of national security issues. I had worked for both Democrats and Republicans. I was a civil servant who had worked for whoever was my commander-in-chief, very proudly. And I just felt that the tone and tenor of politics had become fundamentally unbecoming of the country that I served and the country that all Americans loved. And so I started thinking about running. But what actually got me in the race is healthcare. I had a particular experience where my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer when she did not have health insurance. She had let it lapse. She had struggled with healthcare her entire life because she had breast cancer as a 31-year-old mom. So when my parents divorced and she lost her job, she was unable to afford insurance because she had a pre-existing condition. And so they just gouged her for any plan that was available to her. She went 5.5 years with no insurance. My brother and I finally helped her get insurance after those 5.5 years of having no, regular checkup, no gynecological exam, nothing. That policy that we got her was $1,000 a month with a $10,000 deductible. That was her highest bill in suburban Detroit. And in 2009, without us knowing, she let it lapse. And in September of 2009, she walked into an ER and was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. So the same week and the same month that we were dealing with her terminal diagnosis was the same week and the same month that we were filling out the paperwork for her to declare bankruptcy. So when I saw the House of Representatives vote to repeal protections for people with pre-existing conditions, that was a huge turning point for me. And literally the Rose Garden ceremony where they were celebrating this decision was the day that I decided to run. It had nothing to do with national security in the end. And I think that it's important. I mention it because for all my background in national security, what connected me to people was my experience with healthcare. And we need to be able, as foreign policy people, to speak to people's wallets and speak to people's kids. I believe we are done with the days where basically since World War II, the foreign policy elite of either Democrats or Republicans have come together and decided what our foreign policy was going to be. I think we have entered a phase where we need, as American foreign policy leaders, to explain and sell the idea of being deeply engaged abroad to a public that has become deeply suspicious of that action. You know, people ask me, after being in the national security world and then coming into elected service, was it a huge transition? And I say no. I was able to win because I talked about the issues that matter the most in my district. That's the price of healthcare, the price of prescription drugs, and clean water. Most people do not get kept up late at night because of foreign policy. So my point here in saying this is that for people in government, for people in the national security world, the needs of the people have to come first. Everything has to be vectored back to what makes people safe and what makes people prosperous. When I talk to my voters in small towns about, let's say, NATO, if I ask my dad, for instance, what do you think about NATO? And he's my dad. I've been in national security for a long time now. He'll say, I think it was really important in the Cold War, really important against the Russians. Not everyone pays their bills. That's what he would say. That means we have not done our job. Those of us who believe in a strong NATO alliance have not done our job to explain to the American public why NATO is still relevant. And what I would say is most national security people and foreign policy people that I used to spend my time with will say, well, Alyssa, how do we get them to care about these issues? And I'll say, it is not their job to automatically care. It is your job, including everyone in this room, to explain why they should care. And I think that's the question I would offer to all of you, is what have you done to explain to the public why national security and foreign policy issues matter to their lives in a way that affects their pocketbooks and their kids? We have to make the case that these institutions make people safer and makes them more prosperous. And speak to them directly. I would say there's a couple of reasons, the couple things we can do. One, speak directly to their pocketbooks and their families, and how something like NATO is going to make their grandkids more safe. Number two, tell stories, don't just wonk out on policy. I'm going to hazard a guess that many of you in this room are excellent policy wonks, but human beings are wired for stories. That's why cavemen painted, cave paintings, because we like stories. So instead of talking about, mutually assured destruction and the importance of still blunting a strong Russia, talk about what it's like to be that man in one of the Baltic states and what it's like to have Russia as a neighbor after being under Soviet control for so many years. Tell the story. Lastly, we need to communicate broadly. We are not doing anyone a favor by talking to them about foreign policy. They are doing us a favor by listening. So whether you're a CIA analyst in Baghdad or a platoon leader in Kandahar or a member of Congress or the President of the United States, your bosses are the taxpayer, and we depend on them for our support and their vote. And now we depend on them for their acquiescence and their agreement on our foreign policy. I'm gonna wrap it up here. We have a lot of work to do, but I think whenever the Trump administration transitions to another administration, this idea that somehow we'll snap back to a previous order is mistaken. And our job is to imagine a new reality, new partnerships, new coalitions, and a new approach to foreign policy. I will leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thanks for being engaged citizens.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. That's brilliant. I should have said, I mean, you wouldn't think I was a journalist, would you? That all of that was on the record, and the Q&A is off the record.
I'm going to assume.
Or are you on? Okay, so
great.
it says here off, but
That's fine.
I'm very delighted if you're happy to step into the whole on the record thing for the whole session. I'm just going to throw one or two questions at you, and then we'll open it up. I just wonder, in the light of what we know about foreign policy by tweet, whether NATO is actually operative as an alliance.
Oh.
Is there a sense in which it would be unwise, if you're a Bolt, to assume the guarantee is still operative?
If you're a Bolt?
From the Baltic Republic.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure if that was like a...
A Bolt from
no,
the
no,
blue.
no. I think NATO is absolutely still operative. And they're, anyone who's been around NATO, they have amazing machinery that sort of the alliance is engaged in at any one time that may be off the front pages and off our TV screens, but that goes on all the time. Most importantly to me is joint exercises and joint operations.
But in a serious situation, and it's the president I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean...
Can he be relied upon to do the right thing in a crisis with a NATO
You
member?
mean live up to our
Exactly.
responsibilities of the alliance?
Exactly.
I think it's a fair question to ask whether this president would heed the call if there was some sort of Article 5 question on the table. I do think that there are people around the president who still do deeply believe in the alliance. And I think that the fact that the president has continued to put resources and U.S. forces out in Europe is an important signal of the value of deterrence and that we are still engaged in the NATO fight. But it's a fair question. And I think the whole question of how this president deals with Russia has been a real conundrum for a lot of people who have watched. And it is unclear to me if the president would respond in kind. That said, I do still think that there are plenty of people, certainly at the Defense Department, who would be urging him to move forward with a response should there be a need for one. But it's a fair question.
Maybe a little more out there as a question, but I just wonder when you look at the effect of, for example, the Iraq and Afghan conflicts in damaging public trust in intelligence assessment. I mean, we've had a particular case of that in the UK with the way the case was made for the Iraq War. But now the fact that you have a president who essentially finds out what's going on in the world from Fox or his own Twitter feed, is there an existential threat to the intelligence community? I mean, what's the point in spending tens of billions for something that the man at the top is not even going to read or digest or be influenced by?
Well, listen, there's no doubt that this has been a really difficult moment for the intelligence community. I mean, basically, from the beginning, the Trump administration has sort of acted like, the coach of a football team that insults his quarterback or his running back publicly. It's just been very, very difficult for those of us from the intelligence community, and obviously with strong links back to the intelligence community, to feel like your commander-in-chief has been publicly attacking you since day one. That's very difficult. I do think that, and I know that the intelligence community has a greater purpose than just writing the president's daily brief and providing that intelligence to the president directly. And lots of presidents have had different views of how much they want every single day from the intelligence community, not just this president. That said, there's a huge enterprise out there working particularly side by side with our military that is active every single day below the level of president. There are operations being run right now. I got briefed on them in Iraq, countering ISIS, that are pivotal to the security of everyone in this room and everyone in the United States, that continue unabated. There are many corners of the intelligence community that, because the president isn't interested, they actually have significant freedom of action. So I don't think it's fair to say, what's the point if the president doesn't read the intelligence and absorb it? It's always been about a lot more than just writing basically the classified version of the New York Times for the president every day.
Lastly, and this is a broader question, and you did touch on it a few times, in your presentation, but in terms of the changing climate for foreign policy formulation, the fact, as you've put it, that there won't simply be a return to the old way of doing things once this president is gone, and the populist pressures, the transactional view of things like NATO, trade agreements. I mean, are you concerned that in a sense that form of establishment foreign policy making, well, you've said it's gone, but that it won't be possible to rekindle a national consensus on an activist foreign policy for the foreseeable future?
No, I don't think it's like terminal. I just think we're going to have to work a heck of a lot harder. So, for instance, I represent Michigan State University. It's a university, all told, between students and faculty is about 50,000 people. It's huge. And so I'm around a lot of young people all the time. So if you're 19 years old and you're a Michigan State student, you don't remember 9/11. That wasn't part of your consciousness as a human being. You know the aftermath. And you only know us in long entrenched wars in the Middle East. You only know us spending billions of dollars abroad for things that at best look like a draw. You only know that in some parts of the country, people are doing worse than their parents and their kids are set up to do worse than them. And you look at sending our resources abroad and you just say, why? And then let's not forget places like the Midwest send a huge number of people into the military, right? So the people who are actually wounded and dying on the battlefield are from, my part of the world. So it's not terminal, but this is my point. Like, we got to hustle to make that case. And we have to do it in ways that have been different than the past. In the past, as long as senior foreign policy leaders in the US were able to fly to the UK and have those same senior level conversations with people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Defense, and we were able to bring together senior people from France and from Italy, like, we were good if we had that internal elite conversation. That's done in the United States. And therefore, we need to change our paradigm on how we engage our citizens in foreign policy. That's hard. We don't have a model for that. I will happily take one if there's someone in the audience who's seen it done well, but I don't think most Western countries are particularly good at this. And that's a real problem. So I can convince that 19-year-old that we need to do something. But man, it's harder work.
I mean, without being too much of a prophet of doom, I mean, is it another 9/11? Is it some huge national moment that would be required to remind people that the US cannot be safe without alliances?
No, because guess what? Because in my state, there is a real concern about the role of China, for instance, abroad, right? If you look at the economy in my state and how many jobs have transitioned either out of existence or over to places where labor is much cheaper. People see China cheating in the international system. They may not agree with the tariffs and President Trump's approach to dealing with China, but that undercurrent sentiment that China needs to be pushed back on is very strong in a place like Michigan. So that to me doesn't say disengagement. That says that can be vectored into a really strong, what I think we need, which is a strong muscular approach to dealing with China's military, economic, and sort of social push forward, and encroachment on some of the things that sort of international norms. So I don't think we need a 9/11. I would never wish that on anyone, on any nation. I do think it's about vectoring concerns that everyday people have into a foreign policy that they get and that's reasonable, right? We're not going to remake the world in our image, nor should we ever want to. We need to be clear about our goals vis-a-vis, for instance, China or in the Middle East. And then we need to stick to them. Clapping for goals.
Fabulous. Well, let's take some questions from the... I think your hand was the first up, gentleman with glasses.
I'm Garrison from the Australian. Thank you very much for your speech. Sorry. I've got a very loud booming voice.
And I'm going to stand up here. I'm sorry to be
No,
so I
no,
can
no,
like,
of course.
see the audience.
Sorry, Congresswoman Richard Ferguson from The Australian, focusing on China, where in Australia we share the same concerns as people in Michigan. What's your assessment of the strength of alliances in the Asia Pacific when it comes to China? And should other US allies be following the lead of countries like Australia, where, for example, they're boosting military engagement and also doing things like banning Huawei?
Sure. So this is why I find it so important to have a strong approach to the world and to have strong and constantly be caring and feeding for our alliances, because the United States cannot deal with China by itself, especially given that they're closer to your neighborhood than they are to our neighborhood. So in a perfect world, we are constantly caring and feeding for our alliances in places like Southeast Asia, where we're creating an alternative for those nations to China. I think I have a real problem with the threats to freedom of navigation, and I think the United States should be working very hard with our allies and partners to demonstrate that we are a Pacific power and we have the right to go anywhere in international waters. And I do think that we have to crack down on companies like Huawei, on the threats to and the theft of intellectual property. I think that there are a bunch of norms that China is violating right now, and there needs to be some consequence to that. That said, we can't go off like Yosemite Sam, just like shooting off in the air. We need to have a coherent policy, and we need to recognize that the Chinese tend to be better at combining their military policy with their economic policy, with their sort of social and cultural policy than we are. So my hope is that a new administration would understand that while we need to continue to keep our eye on the ball on things like terrorist threats, that great power competition is alive and well and requires a very different approach to China in particular.
Gentleman here. I think you're probably going to follow up on China, are you? Or Japanese perspective.
Thank you very much. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. So I watch Amazon Prime films. It's a Chinese factory in the USA.
Yes, I've seen it.
You see
American Factory. If you haven't seen this documentary,
Yeah.
American Factory,
Yeah.
highly recommend it to everyone. It's a Chinese company reopening a closed factory in Ohio and attempting to do Chinese-owned manufacturing in the United States. It's fascinating.
And so I'm very interested in your presentation because the voters in the U.S. sees Chinese effect directly. For example, Chinese factory in USA, and also some U.S. farmers want China to buy their product in the trade negotiations. And how do you see the dynamics between the usually voters' mindset and U.S. foreign policy and security policy towards China?
Sure. I mean, I think trade is a positive thing and it's an inevitable thing, and we just need trade that lives up to common norms and standards. I'm from an agricultural state. I live on a soybean farm. We need China as a market to go back and forth and sell our products. We want that. And you know what? I welcome companies coming to the United States and doing direct investment. I don't think anyone in the world does manufacturing as well as we do, but it has to live up to a certain set of labor standards and labor norms, which we have in the United States that aren't always carried out in other parts of the world. So I think that, I think sometimes there's this misperception that people in the Midwest don't understand that globalization is happening. If you work in the Flint engine plant, and you know that 100 jobs used to be pickup trucks driving around the plant, dropping off and picking up pallets, and now those are manned by self-driving cars, and 100 guys that you used to work with no longer work there. Like, globalization is happening. That our economy is happening. We probably know it faster than and feel it faster than anyone in this room. So we know it's a part of our lives, but there should be some standards and there should be some thoughtful approach to it. And I think most people are just trying to understand, what is the future of work going to look like? And no one can really articulate that for the Midwest, that we haven't heard that. And it's part of the reason why President Trump has resonated in a state like mine, because he was talking, whether you believe him or not, he was talking about the future of work, wages, the future of American economy in the Midwest, and others weren't. So you got to be able to address those things. But I think we're more savvy than people give us credit for. We know things are changing, and international trade and direct investment is part of that.
This lady here.
Sorry, he's going to run with the microphone.
Thank you. Carol Moore, Democrats Abroad, co-chair of healthcare reform here. But my question is on Russia, and what did you see in your recent trip about Turkey's shift and Russia's expansion taking advantage of the dreadful tweet?
Yeah, so there's no way to get around it. Russia, who had largely seen their influence diminish in the Middle East, were seeking a beachhead on the Mediterranean. We're seeking access to military facilities, to the Mediterranean port. They looked at Syria and, conducted their first out-of-area operation since Afghanistan. And I think they probably feel quite confident that they have nearly achieved their goals. And the long-term path for Syria will involve Russia in some way. And for Turkey, I think that they accept that. They may not love the Russians every single day, but they've accepted that a stable Syria with heavy Russian involvement is probably better for their long-term interests than a chaotic Syria with no clear pathway forward. And I don't love the methods the Turks used, but I do understand the logic in sort of accepting that reality. And I think that, part of the breaking of trust between the U.S. and our allies and partners is that there are other countries waiting in the wings to take advantage of that. It's a zero-sum situation where if we decide it's not important to nurture our relationships, China and Russia, by mere nature of certainly China's economic power, but just their presence in the world, means that it's more likely, particularly smaller allies and partners, will start to turn toward those countries and hedge their bets. That is not good for long-term U.S. interests. So I don't think the Turks woke up one morning and said, Russia is our enduring friend, and everything they say is going to they say jump and we say how high. I don't believe that. But do they accept reality that Russia is going to be a player in Syria and now in the Middle East for the long term? Yes. It's a real problem. It's a real problem for NATO. Having Turkey engage with the Russians, not just in sort of words, but in deeds. And one of the hardest conversations we had in Turkey was about their decision to purchase the S-400 system. And we made the point repeatedly to them that it's one thing if you buy a Russian system, and you're a NATO ally, and we have a problem with you. But you have to remember the entire alliance and all our allies and partners around the world are watching how we respond when you break faith with NATO and buy a Russian system. So it's not just about pushing back on Turkey. It's making a very important statement about whether it's okay or not for alliance members to purchase Russian systems that may undermine NATO systems. So we made that point. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like these conversations were easy. They were not. But it's not, for me, it's not just about words with Turkey, it's about deeds.
This gentleman.
Congressman, thank you for your comments. My name is Felix Gedney. I'm a British Army officer. And until about just over a year ago, I was the deputy commander of the coalition in Iraq and Syria.
Thank you for that.
I guess I share your views on the sudden withdrawal from northern Syria. You'd expect that. And the negative impact of that. I guess my question to you is, should we have seen it coming? And so my contention is that what we saw is a perfectly rational decision from your president based on the fact that no other nations stumped up and committed in northern Syria as we were pressing hard, particularly in the post-conflict stabilization effort, for other nations in the coalition to get engaged, which they didn't. Right. Do you think if they had, we'd have seen a different decision?
I think it is certainly true that when we decided to partner with the Kurds, we were going with a subnational group, not a military of some allied or partnered country. We were going with a subnational group because that was the best of of bad options at the time to root out a terrorist group that had made a state from which they were projecting power into the Europe, UK, and into the United States. So we made a decision at the time to work with a group that maybe in other circumstances we wouldn't have worked with because the threat of ISIS was so serious. And you know, given your background, just how real some of those threats were emanating out of that area. We always knew that the Turks did not like it. They made it clear from day one. There was no hiding the ball with the Turks. They demarched us, they engaged us, they told us very clearly from the beginning, we cannot accept that you're working with this group. And we told them, we get it, but we don't see any other option. The Turks clearly waited for us to kick ISIS out of Raqqa, for us to take back huge swaths of territory in Syria, and then began engaging, as I understand it, the Trump administration saying, okay, done. You guys took back those parts of Syria that were controlled by ISIS. We need you to now give up your support, stop helping the YPG, build up their ability to govern, stop. And the truth is we never reconciled within the United States what the long-term plan was with those Kurds in Syria and for Syria in general, nor is it ours decision just alone to make. We still don't have a clear path forward on what's going to happen in Syria. And that open question left a vacuum that the Turks had always wanted to enter, to fill. They attempted a year ago in December of 2018. My understanding, again, this is all from press, is that the Turks said, we're going in, and the president acquiesced, and then Secretary of Defense Mattis said, no, I'm going to resign if you do this. The Secretary Mattis resigned. The president changed his decision. 11 months later, or 10 months later, the same proposition was offered by the Turks, and this time, as I understand it, the president did not push back. And we have what we have. So was there some inevitability to it? All I know is this isn't the way that we should be dealing with such sensitive matters after people have lost their lives and fought ISIS. This could have been negotiated in a much more reasonable way to figure out the new territory and the new reality in Syria at the barrel of a gun is not the way we needed to be doing this, especially when you have U.S. forces so close and proximate to the Turkish forces. So it was always a strain between us and Turkey, but I do not believe this was the only outcome.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that, which is whether you see in the Turkish so-called safe zone a territorial revisionism following the Ukraine. Turkish nationalists, when one is in Turkey, they constantly talk about Erdogan as the kind of new Ottoman and going south and the Alep province and all these things. Are they there for the long haul? Is it effectively a redrawing of a frontier there?
I think that the Turkish government sees and wants Turkish control of their border area inside Syria for as long as Syria remains an unstable, lightly or undergoverned state. And we have made very clear from the perspective of the House Armed Services Committee that any attempt at ethnic cleansing, at forced migration, at the ethnic removal of folks from that area is completely unacceptable, as is forced repatriation of Syrians who are currently living in Turkey. And let's acknowledge Turkey has borne the real burden more than any other single nation. They have borne the burden of significant Syrian refugees living in their countries. You just have to go there for a visit to see them in their parks, on the streets. Turkey has a legitimate concern about the number of Syrian refugees in their country, but any forced return violates international law and would be a distinct problem if they attempted to do that.
Nick.
Thank you. Nick Robertson from CNN. My question sort of follows up on all of this, but maybe slightly broader. You talked about General Mattis resigning over the drawdown in Syria. If the handshake is to mean anything, we have to have trust in the checks and balances. And we seem to be in a period where the checks and balances don't seem to be working. So can you talk more about that and how that trust that your system of decision making can challenge the principal decision maker?
So here's what President Trump has really taught us in spades in Washington. We have given in our system significant authorities to the president, to the executive branch to dictate foreign policy. And while our Constitution gives the U.S. Congress the right and the responsibility to authorize military force, it does not give us a special check and balance on decisions to pull back from those wars, to pull back from those military engagements. And in general, things that have gone on as tradition in the past, whether you had Democratic presidents or Republican presidents, and their way of engaging the Congress as a matter of tradition is just that. It's actually, in many cases, not law.
So my question is, how do you change that?
Well, for sure. I mean, I think, there's a couple of things. First of all, we have to, at least in Congress, do the bare minimum of live up to our constitutional responsibilities, which we are not doing at present. And that has to do with the authorization of military force. I will say very plainly that since the Iraq War decision and the very, very important consequential vote where members of Congress had to vote on whether to authorize war against Iraq, and then a bunch of people lost their seats because of it, Congress has sort of like backed away slowly from their responsibility to authorize military force. So job number one is to actually live up to our constitutional responsibilities. As an Army wife and the mother of a stepdaughter who could be deployed to the Middle East anytime, you better believe that's something that I spend my time on, getting Congress to do its basic responsibilities. That's number one. Number two is there is a conversation going on within the halls of Congress about, kind of what do we do when we're beyond this administration and what traditions might better be laid in law so that we don't have this situation again. The other day when when the president authorized the operation against al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader in Syria, tradition holds that a president of the United States, if they're sending off a very dangerous mission for a high-value target, would inform what's called the Gang of Eight, right? The top leaders in the House and Senate, bipartisan. That is tradition, that is not law. That's an interesting thing to discuss as whether that should be enshrined in law. I don't know. But that's a debate worth having. And part of this is the conversation that's happening internally about how we prepare for what's next. And again, it is by no means assured that President Trump will be out of office in a year. I think if I had to wage a bet as someone who's from Michigan, I could see him having another 4 years. No. And I think, as a new member of Congress with a national security background, myself and a number of others are thinking about how to be prepared for that next administration, whether Democrat, Republican, whatever, and what things in foreign policy should be tradition and what things should be law.
I'm sorry, I'm going to beg another follow-up privilege here, but do you, by moving towards impeachment, guarantee that second term, given that it's not going to get through the Senate?
Well, so just to review the bidding, I am from a very Republican-leaning district. Trump won my district by 7 points, which is a significant margin. And I'm in a swing state. I'm in Michigan, and most people believe that the combination of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania will decide the future election, the presidential election. I'm from a district that really values service, but also values independent thinking. And I, for many months, did not believe that impeachment was the right path for the country, that elections are the best way to dictate who should be sitting in highest office. That changed for me with the facts coming to light on the president reaching out to a foreign leader, the Ukrainian head of state, and asking for information on another American in an attempt to affect the 2020 election. And it was different for many reasons for me. It was different because it was the president and his lawyer getting on TV and acknowledging that they reached out to a foreign leader to ask for information. It was different because it was prospective and not retrospective. It was thinking about the 2020 election, not reviewing the bidding on what happened in 2016. And it was different because I felt my oath of office kick in to protect and defend the Constitution, and in particular to protect our political system from foreign influence. And so I and myself and 6 other members of Congress, all either former intelligence or former military, wrote a joint op-ed in the Washington Post calling for an impeachment inquiry. And that was important at the time because we are all from districts that went for Donald Trump. So it sort of signaled a change for many members of Congress. I was aware at the time that making that decision may be the end of my political career. I made that decision knowing that. And for those of you who listen to the New York Times, the Daily podcast, or who watch CNN, we had kind of 3 town halls in 3 days that were carried on TV and carried in different publications. And they were very, very difficult town halls. Certainly there are people who supported the decision. There were many, many people who didn't, and many people in the middle. But there just has to be consequences for some actions. And for me, this was an important statement. Calling for an inquiry was an important statement to indicate for any future president that there are lines they cannot cross. It will not just be that elections are the only measure of behavior, particularly if we're talking about a behavior that could potentially be illegal and that invites foreign influence in our elections. So it is to be determined whether calling for such inquiry will affect the outcome of the election. It may well be, but it was important enough for me, and particularly after taking the oath of office, to move ahead and call for it.
We've still got time for a few. We'll see if we can take another 2 or 3 questions.
Hi, just 2 very quick questions. First one is, you spoke about Turkey, but one of the issues that raises is you would have allies whose interest will not be in keeping with each other. Clearly, for example, in Syria with Turks, that's the case. And how do you deal with that? From what I have heard from you, it was more about, yes, you acknowledge Turkey's concerns, but it was more about also setting an example of how Turkey is dealt with because of some of their conduct. The other is, you alluded to Trump having another term is not a foregone conclusion. It's quite possible it could happen. And we are in a situation where we could have a Corbyn-led government, potentially. How do you see the last 4 or 5 years of, last 3 years of UK-US relations been interesting. How do you see it's going forward in the next 5 years or 4 years if we end up with that combination?
So I can barely understand American politics. There's no way I can understand what is going on. I got quite an education from my cab driver yesterday who ran for a local council seat on Nigel Farage's in his slate, and so I had a sort of 40-minute storyline of the sort of Brexit vote. I do not pretend to understand what is going on in British politics. I will say my answer to the second question is the same thing as my answer to the first, that alliances are different than partnerships. Alliances are enduring, long-term, they are bendable without breaking. That is only if we keep them up and invest in them. But we have had tough moments with the UK. I mean, I was serving in government, I'm going to forget his name, unfortunately, when the UK decided to release one of the Lockerbie bombers and allow him to go home to Libya. That was a very difficult decision that the United States did not agree with as a policy matter. And we had some pretty scratchy back and forth for many, many months before that happened. But our alliance does not break, it bends. And I would say the same thing is true of Turkey. The goal is not to break the relationship with the Turks. We need the Turks in a whole bunch of ways. And they need us. They need the alliance. We have had tough moments with Turkey before, such as in the run-up to the Iraq War when they didn't give us access to Incirlik, to a military location. We will have scratchy moments with them in the future. The goal is to bend appropriately and not break. And that goes for whatever the heck is going to happen in your politics and our politics and in the coming years.
I think we've got time for one more. Very shocked that you met a Brexit party supporting London cabbie who wouldn't stop talking. This lady here, I think did you want, we're going to give you the honour of the last question, I think. Let's double check the time. Yes, we're on 1400.
Okay, I'll be quick. My name is Elizabeth Braw, and I lead the Modern Terrace project here at RUSI, and I'm also married to a Michigander, so I'm. It's rare that you hear this much praise of the great state of Michigan. I agree with you. The nicest people in the U.S. live in the Midwest, and possibly on Earth live in the Midwest. My question is about China, and you mentioned Michigan State University. Now, a lot of Chinese students benefit from education at the best universities in the world, many of which are in the U.S. I wonder, do you think, given that China has put into practice a sort of exploitation of the globalized world and its opportunities, do you think it's time maybe to limit access for Chinese students to American universities?
So this is one of the toughest problems. And in Michigan, I represent Michigan State, but we also have University of Michigan, we have Oakland University, we have a lot of universities in sort of this southeast Michigan area. And, regardless of what our military does abroad and what our foreign policy is, one of the greatest assets we have in the United States, and I think you also have it here in the UK, is that the greatest minds in the world want to come and study at our universities and make their lives in the United States. That is a huge competitive advantage. If the greatest entrepreneurs and greatest minds from China want to come and study at our universities and then invent those things in the United States, I want that. And the minute we don't have that, we start to see our competitive advantage in the world decrease precipitously. So it's this really tough balance between making sure we are always that place where people want to come and being competitive with other universities around the world, with attracting the best students, and then making sure our legitimate intellectual property isn't being stolen out from under us. My brother happens to be a professor in the hard sciences. He's a plant geneticist. And he has had his own run-ins with students where there's an open question about what their intent is in joining his lab. And it doesn't just have to do with, military secrets. It has to do with the whole spectrum of things that would help in some ways the Chinese sort of catch up to where the United States is. I'm reticent, even though I'm a national security person and I don't want anything stolen from our labs, I'm extremely reticent to start with some draconian measures that clamp off that pull, that sucking sound that we pull from the rest of the world to attract the world's talent. It's something I know our university leadership is really struggling with. They don't know how to deal with it either. I know that there are certain departments at the universities that are, being contacted by the FBI. They have suspicions of these research students, and they're put in a very, very personal, tough position. I don't know what the right mix is. I think our universities are trying to work through that now, but I am extremely nervous about shutting down one of the true competitive advantages that the United States has. And I'd be really reticent to call for tough measures too early.
Alyssa, I'm sorry, we're over time. That's my fault. But I think we could all agree that we've had a fantastically candid and heartfelt presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.